Hi, everybody. Welcome to this short session this morning on how to actually create a purpose statement for your team. And you might think, well, why should I go to that trouble? Well, we're living in a world, as we know, that is full of distraction. In fact, the great management consultant Warren Bennett said the greatest challenge of the 21st century is the management of distraction. And I think he's right. We're being bombarded left, right, and center by a whole lot of different distractions. And what that means, of course, is it's harder for us all individually and collectively to stay on purpose. So it makes good sense for any team to have a statement that encapsulates what its primary purpose is. Now, if you doubt this, then what I suggest you do at your next team meeting is just go around the table and ask each person what they perceive to be the purpose of the team. And you might actually be, I guess you might even say, unpleasantly surprised at the variation of viewpoints about that, which really does illustrate the fact that teams need a purpose statement. So just go around the room and ask people, what do you think our primary purpose is as a team, and see what happens. I think you might actually be quite surprised at what you come back with. All right, so let me share my slides and we'll launch into the presentation proper. You'll receive a copy of the slides and the recording at the end of the session. So those of you who don't know who I am, if I could briefly introduce myself, Tim Baker. You can see that I'm an author. I conduct keynote addresses on leadership and performance. I run workshops, and I play rugby in the Golden Oldies competition here in Brisbane. So I do a few things, and I won't go into great detail about that, but that gives you a bit of a sense of who I am. Now, the book Winning Teams is ultimately where this comes from. I found that one of the 8 characteristics of high-performing teams was that a high-performing team, differentiating itself from a mediocre team, is a team that has a very clear purpose. They know exactly what's required of them. And in order to write this book, I got a number of testimonials from key players in the sporting world, in academia, and also in the public and private sectors as well. And basically there's some very nice comments about the book there, and I have a special offer for you at the end of this presentation, which I'll talk about shortly. And Nick Farr-Jones, who was a great Wallaby captain of Australia, had a nice comment to make about my book. Okay, let's get into the topic per se. Now, what you're seeing in front of you is the 8 characteristics of high-performing teams, is what I cover in the book. And you can see on the outside circle on the right-hand side, these are the 8 characteristics. Now, I probably could envisage other characteristics as well, but ultimately, from my own observations, working with teams for decades, and also my own research and my own reading, I came up with these 8 characteristics. Now, you can see the arrow is pointed at one of those characteristics, which I'm covering today, which is creating purpose. And ultimately, any high-performing team, as I mentioned, is a team that's very crystal clear about its purpose. And so it makes good sense for you to start to craft a statement around what your team's purpose is. I know that your organization has perhaps a vision statement or a purpose statement, or, they have a range of different things, but this is different. This is what your team is actually about. So this is a microcosm of the total organization. And I'm going to talk to you about how you might go about that this morning. Now, one of the objections that people might have at this point when we're covering a topic like this is, how can I provide any clarity in my team when we're pushed from pillar to post? Now, it's true, as I mentioned, all teams are pushed from pillar to post. And I would say, paradoxically, that's why it's important to have a clear purpose statement. Because if your team isn't clear about what its main purpose is, and that is not just you, but every single member of your team, then it's likely to lead to more distraction, more diversion, more behavior that's not consistent or directly related to your purpose as a team. So it makes good sense for you to create a purpose statement. Now, when I talk about a purpose statement, I'm not talking about a one-page document. I'm talking about a single sentence which encapsulates what your team's primary purpose is. So, for example, if your team is an internal service provider, such as HR, such as, say, finance, then your purpose is obviously, your customers at least are internal. And so your purpose statement needs to encapsulate that. And there are other teams, of course, are more externally facing. And if you're servicing customers beyond your organization, well, then your purpose statement must encapsulate that as well. So really what I'm talking about here is a single sentence which encapsulates what your team's purpose statement is about. Now, you might think, well, as a team leader, I can see the sense in that. So why don't I just create the purpose statement? And why don't I just communicate that to my team? Wouldn't that be the end of it? Well, I would suggest to you it's better than nothing. But I would say to you that we want your team members to be completely immersed in the purpose statement. And in order for them to be completely bought into what your purpose statement is, they need to have skin in the game. And so I would suggest to you that creating a purpose statement for your team is a collaborative exercise with all your team members involved in the process. And by doing that, of course, everyone has an emotional attachment to the purpose statement. And that's ultimately what I'm really getting at there when I talk about that. Now, 3 things I want to cover this morning. Very simply, I want to talk about the importance of a purpose, which I've kind of covered already, but I do want to just sort of make it clear why I believe this is a critically important thing to do. And then we're going to actually have a look at some purpose statements and understand what the ingredients of a purpose statement is. So what actually gets included and what is not included in a purpose statement. So what do they actually look like and how do you create them? And then I've got a special offer for you at the end of this presentation. So let's start with the importance of purpose. Now, let's start with a concept of what the purposeless team is. This is a team that has no rudder, that has no purpose. And basically a team without a clear and compelling purpose will obviously get sidetracked easily and frequently. And I'm sure you've seen this in your own organization, and I'm sure you've experienced this yourself in your own careers. When you're working in a team that's not crystal clear about its purpose, then it's obviously very vulnerable to all of the pressures that are revolving around the team. And so the team will often spend a lot of time working on things that are not directly related to its purpose. The difference is, of course, the team itself doesn't know that. And the reason it doesn't know that is because it is purposeless. So it doesn't have a purpose. So it doesn't even know that it's not working on purpose. So a purposeless team is busy, undoubtedly, but working on activities that aren't always useful and often neglect the tasks that are pivotal to its purpose. And what that does is not just confusing for the team itself, but it's also confusing for everybody else that happens to deal with the team. So when people interact with a purposeless team, they're not quite sure either what the team should be doing. They might have a fair idea what they think the team should be doing, but they're not completely sure about it. So it creates this enormous discord between the team and the people that interact with the team itself. So it's not a very pleasant place to be. And in their heart of hearts, the members of the team know that the team doesn't have a crystal clear purpose. So they're far more vulnerable to be doing work that is just at the whim of somebody else and not really considering what really drives that team and what its purpose is. One of the ways I like to conceptualize, and I've conceptualized this in my book, Winning Teams, is that if you think about it this way, if you think about purpose as a bit like a coat hanger in your closet. Now, most of us have got too many coat hangers. They seem to breed, don't they? Every time you look in the cupboard, there seems to be more and more coat hangers. That's been my experience, at least. And pretty much the coat hangers can be an annoyance or a nuisance. And quite honestly, the coat hangers themselves are, are not they don't really have a purpose if they're just in the closet. They're just hanging there, but nothing's hanging from the coat hanger. Now, it's only when we hang a pair of trousers or a garment from the coat hanger, it is at that stage that the coat hanger is actually valuable. And what I'm getting at here is that words on a piece of paper, which of course is a purpose statement, is probably better than nothing, but really it's a bit like the coat hanger with no garment hanging off it in the closet. In other words, we know it's there, but really it's purposeless until we hang something from it. So I would suggest to you that a coat hanger can be extremely purposeful when we use it. And I would say to you that a purpose statement can be extremely useful for a team when it's used. In other words, if you work out what your purpose statement is, and you look at all of the tasks, activities, and projects that you do in your team, and you think, does this fit with our purpose or does it not? Of course, then the purpose statement becomes really valuable. So I often think that purpose statements that are just words on paper, or perhaps they're a plaque on the wall in your office environment, in a sense, they're useless unless they're used. So I'm not suggesting that you just create a purpose statement for the sake of creating it. I'm suggesting that you create a purpose statement for the sake of being able to use it in terms of being able to identify as a yardstick all the activities that you do in a team. Now, here are some questions that you might like to ask yourself, and I think it's a great place to start. Now, you may ask yourself these questions. Of course, these questions are open to your team members as well, but it probably just underlines the need for a purpose statement. For example, the first and obvious question is, do you know what your team's purpose is? Now, you might think, well, honestly, I don't, it'd be demeaning to even answer that question, but do you really know what the purpose of your team is? And could you capture that purpose in a few words? Could you actually, if I was sitting in a room with you now and I said to you, what's the purpose of your team? Would you be able to just blurt out an articulate statement which demonstrates what the purpose of your team is? Or would you need time to think about it? Would you need 2 sentences? Would you need more than that? Would you find it so difficult to be able to just identify it and define it to 1 sentence? Now, of course, if you as a team leader are having trouble with that, well, guess what? Your team members are going to have trouble with that as well. And more importantly, the people you interact with outside the team are going to have trouble with that as well. So that's a good starting question for you. Another question is, have I communicated this purpose to my team members? Can you remember the last time you actually sat down with your team members and articulated what you believe to be their purpose or the purpose of the team? Now, you might think, well, why should I do that? Because surely my team members would be crystal clear. They'd be aware. Well, as I said earlier, if you think that, then try this exercise out. Just go around the table at the next team meeting and ask people to articulate what their purpose is as a team. And you might be very surprised at what people come up with. And I did this with a group of executives not long ago, and I went around the table and each of them explained what they thought the purpose of the team was. And at the end of it, I made the observation to the team that nobody had actually mentioned anything about people in any of their statements. So we had 8 people present, and not one of them mentioned anything about people. It was always about getting the product out the door or whatever. And I made that statement because I thought at the end of the day, they're missing their purpose. As an executive team, their job was to get the very best from the people that they lead, that is, the rest of the organization. And I felt that they'd missed their purpose. They were too focused on the task. Now, of course, the product or the task is extremely important. But an executive team where 8 people don't mention anything about people would be, to me, a concern, and it was. Do your team members understand the purpose and its role? Are they able to connect the dots between what they're doing day to day and what you're actually aiming to do? Do they accept the purpose? Are they bought into the purpose, or do they think that's just, your own version of the world? And so to them, they just ignore the purpose statement and continue on their merry way. Are all the team members in your team committed to the purpose? Or do they tend to go off on tangents? And do you notice that people often do, different activities that have absolutely nothing to do with the purpose of the team? Do all your team members know how their work is tracking against the purpose? Would they be able to, again, connect the dots between the activity they do and the purpose of your team? And are you supporting your team members to achieve their purpose? Because obviously there are lots and lots of distractions, lots of influences that will get in the way of your team achieving its purpose. And I think one of the key things that a team leader should do is to actually give people some clarity around how they can achieve their purpose, and to pave the way for that by making sure that other things don't get in the way. So there's some questions that you might like to ask yourself to get things moving. And if you find that it's difficult to answer some of those questions, then it's probably time for you to sit down with your team members and to actually craft a purpose statement where everybody in your team has some commitment to doing that. I personally think that purpose statements that are created within the team are far more real and effective. Here are some famous purpose statements you might like to look at. Now, these of course are organizational statements, but it gives you a sense and a flavor of what I'm really trying to do here. So Coca-Cola's purpose statement is to refresh the world in body, mind, and spirit. Apple's committed to the best personal computing experience to students, educators, creative professionals, and customers around the world through its innovative hardware, software, and internet offerings. Okay, so Ben & Jerry, one of my favorite ice creams. Our aim is to make the best possible ice cream in the nicest possible way. See how crystal clear that is? And see how it just gives everybody a sense of what's important. So there's a couple of statements that you might like to look at. So if you look at those statements and you think, well, what have they all got in common? Well, what they've all got in common is that they're inspirational to start with. Now, you might say, well, why do they need to be inspirational? Well, it's far better than just being dull and boring, isn't it? So you really need some inspiration there to basically motivate people towards the key purpose of what you're attempting to do. You'll notice that each of those statements is expressed in a single sentence. Well, Apple's might be a little longer than the others, but you can see that ultimately the exercise is to try to complete them in one sentence if possible. And you can also see that the focus is on one key driver. And this is where we can get confused. I think a purpose statement should be just ultimately about the one key driver What are you trying to achieve in your team? And of course, who are you serving in your team? Now, we all have customers, as we know. They're either internal or external to the business or external, as in outside the business. But ultimately, we all have customers. We're all there for a reason. I mean, the only reason I have this opportunity of presenting to you today is because you have customers. And ultimately, having a clarity around who those customers are is a very good place to start with your purpose statement. And then, of course, as I said earlier, I think it's really important for you to try to do this collaboratively. Now, how do you do this? Let me explain to you the process, because you'd be surprised at how incredibly powerful this is. But what I might do to start with is I might explain to people what the definitions of a good purpose statement are. So you can use this slide, for example, and I would go through these 5 key points. I would also perhaps share with my team a couple of purpose statements that I shared with you earlier. So let's give people a sense of what we mean by a purpose statement. And let's talk about what the characteristics of those are, because we want people to understand what we're aiming to achieve. Then the next thing I would do is, once we've done that, and that shouldn't take too long, is then you ask each person in your team, while they're in the room, to write down their version of the purpose statement for your team. And bear in mind that we're trying to make sure that they cover these key criteria. So people will write down their purpose statement, and once they've written that down, that'll take them a few minutes to do. Just give them time to do that. The next step is, once everyone's written their purpose statement down, what you do is you get everyone in your team to pair up with somebody else. So, for example, if you have 6 people in your team, and of course, if you've got odd numbers, you'll just have to have, 1 extra person in the team. But let's say you've got 6 people in your team. That ultimately means that you're going to have 3 pairs that will get together. Now, what those 3 pairs will do is that they will obviously share their purpose statement with the other person, and vice versa. And then what happens is that you then ask each pair to craft a purpose statement that takes the best out of each statement. So, you would just combine 2 statements, or it's quite possible that one person might say, look, I think you've nailed it. You've captured it perfectly. Let's go with your statement. I think it covers what I'm trying to say, but you've done it far better than I have, whatever it might be. But the bottom line is that both partners are perfectly happy with the statement that they have created for each other. So now, if you think about it, with a team of 6, I've now got 3 purpose statements in the room. And that's good, because now we obviously have to whittle that down to 1 statement. So how do we do that? What's the next step? Well, if it was a team of 6, I might then say, okay, let's break up into 2 groups. We've got group 1, which has got 3 people in it, and group 2, which has got another 3 people in it. And of course, regardless of the size of your team, you can just, engineer that however you choose. And then what you do is the same process. You ask, obviously, 1 pair has already got their statement, and then you brought a 3rd person into that. They're sharing their statement with the pair who've already agreed that their statement pretty much suits their need. And then what happens is, in the group of 3, you integrate those statements to 1. So we've now honed it down to 2 statements. So we've now got 2 statements in the room, and I can assure you this won't take you too long to do it all. I find that the work that I do, it might at the most take you about 40 minutes to produce 1 single purpose statement that everybody's happy with. So now with the team of 6, I've got 2 purpose statements. So what happens next? Right, well, we get, 1 person from each of those triads to write their statement up on a whiteboard. So we've got basically 2 statements on the whiteboard, and now we're going to work together as a team to try to develop a statement where we capture the best of both of those statements. So what we're trying to do now is we're now going to try to create one statement which is the best of the 2 statements. Now, this works brilliantly because everybody in your team has had a say. Everybody has had an input, and everybody's been involved in the discussion, including you. And now we've created one statement that everybody has some emotional attachment to because they've been involved in its creation. So therefore, the purpose statement that you end up with ultimately is one that is owned by your team. And that's how it really works. It's pretty much as simple as that. And you know, you might say, oh yes, but what happens if they produce something that I'm not happy with? Well, don't forget, you're a member of the team and you're having your own input anyway in those discussions. So ultimately, it's not as if you're just sitting there waiting for other people to tell you what the purpose statement is. You're involved as well. But ultimately, you come up with something that's crystal clear, and I think something that you'll find that your team are very happy with. And then your job ultimately is to make sure that the work and the priorities in your team are pretty much focused on the purpose of what your team is. And you'll find that individually people will do this as well, which is always a good thing. So that's pretty much how it works, folks. There's not much else to it than that. And you then can, you know, you can publicize that if you want. You can actually put it on the wall in the plaque if you want. It's really up to you. But the bottom line is the secret of that is that your team members have been engaged in that statement. And that's why it's so powerful. So folks, just to, some of you would be aware because you're loyal attendees, but every Friday at this time, I have a 30-minute short, sharp session, practical session on something of value. Now, next week, I've got another session called the 3 Key Elements of Productive Working Relationships in Teams. So on the 20th of March at 10 o'clock Australian Eastern Standard Time, we will be running through that session. There's the link, and you just go in like you did for this session and register, and you're in. And of course, you get a copy of the slides and the recording at the end, after the session, of course. So we'd love to see you next week at this session. And finally, as I said, there's a special offer that I'd like to make available to you for you taking your valuable time out today to be with me. And I'm going to give you an opportunity to purchase my book, Winning Teams, the 8 Characteristics of High Performing Teams, which is normally $35 on Amazon. And I'm going to give you that book for $25 inclusive of postage. If you'd like to take advantage of that, just send me an email by the close of business and I can organize that for you. I'll sign the book for you and send it out, and away you go. So let me stop sharing for a moment. Okay, so thanks everyone, folks. I hope that's been helpful for you just to demystify how to create a purpose statement. But I think the key thing for you is to do it collaboratively, and you'll find that you won't be disappointed at the results. You'll find that it's probably the most valuable 40 minutes you've spent with your team. And that statement, of course, can be used for a range and variety of different options as far as priority setting and all the rest with your team. So thank you, everyone. I look forward to catching you next Friday, and stay tuned. I'll be sending you a copy of the slides and the recording. Thanks, everyone. All the best. Have a wonderful weekend. Thank you and goodbye.